Far from being moribund, Winston Churchill once observed, Islam is a militant and proselytizing faith that raises fearless warriors at every step. That may have been true 126 years ago, but does it still ring true today? Find out from today's guest on Restoration Spotlight. I'm Hayden Ludwig. What began 14 centuries ago as a Christian heresy, one designed to subdue the earth, remains one of the fundamental enemies of the Christian faith even today. Am I exaggerating? Let's revisit the record. The lands we now call Islam's heartland were once teeming with Christians. Muslim armies threatened to overwhelm Vienna, the capital of Central Europe, just 93 years before America declared independence. A quarter century after 9/11 sparked a new conflict between the Western and Muslim worlds. It's Islam, not Christianity, that reigns in London and soon in New York City as well. As individuals, we know that Muslims may be our most generous friends and hospitable neighbors. But as a religion, they are bound to the Dar al-Islam, the House of Islam, a force commissioned by the Prophet Muhammad for conquest and submission, and it's Christ who stands in the way. So how do we reconcile these two realities? For that answer, we turn to Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, a physician and former U.S. Navy commander. Dr. Jasser is pointing the way for his fellow Muslims through the American Islamic Forum for Democracy, a group that defends constitutional principles against radical jihad. Dr. Jasser, welcome to Restoration Spotlight.
It's great to be with you. Thanks for having me.
Now, I'm going to start with a tough one. The Constitution and Declaration of Independence are fundamentally Christian documents, meaning they're products of men whose ideas about government and human nature are very much rooted in ancient biblical thinking. What I mean by that is they wouldn't have originated in Buddhist or Shinto thinking or in Islamic thinking. Now, you've got a tough job as a patriot reconciling your very strong Muslim faith with these fundamentals. I'm curious, how do you do that?
Well, thanks for having me and thanks for asking these questions. It's so important that people understand sort of, where we are in history today. And I agree with you 100%. There's no doubt that they are a byproduct of Christian thinking and took 1,789 years until those documents, the Declaration 1776, but the Constitution 1789, until they were codified. And I, as a Muslim, understand that Islam, 1,445 years old, still has some reformation and separation of mosque and state. And that's why I dedicated my life to that separation, to that belief that not to take faith out of my personal life, but to do what our founding fathers, especially Thomas Jefferson and so many others did at the founding, which was to understand that, as much as they were Christians, deists who believed in God, but they also understand that to render unto Caesar what is Caesar and unto God's what is God's. The word Christian is not in the documents. They didn't want to debate over what form of Christianity. They wanted a government under God. They wanted one in which the prevention of the establishment of religion was codified. So especially that First Amendment of our Bill of Rights. And those ideas, when my family escaped dictatorship, theocracy in the Middle East, and came to this amazing shining city on a hill, the best democracy on the planet, I wanted to learn from it and say, you know what? The historical process that the Judeo-Christian tradition went through in ultimately culminating in what our founding fathers understood took a while. And I want to learn from that Americanism. And I think ultimately that Americanism can be brought into what is modern Islam. It is not compatible today in normal Islam, and that's why we need deep reformation. And Islam has been stuck in its ossified 10th, 11th century interpretation now for over 1,300 years, but that can happen, but needs deep-seated reform.
Well, there's great wisdom in your response, and I appreciate your humility. It's an incredible response, and I very much agree with you. Now, one of the central tenets of your work is distinguishing between the Islam you practice and then what we might call Islamism or Islamism, or maybe Wahhabism. Walk our listeners through the distinctions there.
So ultimately, there is a pietistic Islam, which is the personal belief between a Muslim and their faith and God. And actually, if you look at the Quran, my father translated the Quran over 10 years of work, and you can even tell there's passages where God is talking to Muslims directly about his message, and then there's others that are more historical. There's no doubt that the historical passages have to be relegated to history and cannot be really brought into modernity, such as polygamy, and other types of passages that really talk about battles that existed, etc. And one of the toughest parts of separating mosque and state is the fact that the Prophet Muhammad had multiple hats. He was the head of state, he was the head of a military, and we believe as Muslims he was given the word of God. So ultimately, when my wife and I talk to our children about the values that we believe to share with the Judeo-Christian tradition, it's about character, morality, the Ten Commandments, the belief in the sanctity of God and of our marriage and our family, the value of the nuclear family, and the importance of honesty and humility and generosity and charity. So all of these principles are pietistic in nature. Prayer to God, the fact that there's no intermediaries between an individual and God. And then there's sort of the public face of the faith, which really is what needs deep-seated reform and is less pietistic and more political. So political Islam has to do with the Islamic State, the identity, when it involves where the Quran is not just a personal book, but becomes the constitution. I've been dedicating my life to make sure that never happens. It's a personal book. It's not related. It can be a source of law, but not the source of law. And I think that's similar to what our founding fathers did. So Islamism is about political movements, the Muslim Brotherhood in Egypt, the Islamic, party in Iran,
right.
The Pakistani national identity. All of these are political movements, parties that have as their core document the Quran, and thus when they get into power, they see themselves as God. They see themselves as the adjudicators of what is God's law and what is not, and therefore we are simply slaves to that. And it's inhuman. It doesn't match with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, and it doesn't match with Western reform of Locke and Voltaire, and then ultimately our founding fathers in America.
So you used a word earlier, Reformation. Speaking as the son of the Protestant Reformation, our understanding of that was not an evolution away from early church principles, but rather a return to getting rid of the accretions that had occurred in the church and returning to more of the fundamentals. And I've heard a similar argument about Islam. Now, with that idea in mind, isn't there a case to be made that really what you're looking for is an evolution of Islam, because what's going on in the 20th and 21st centuries with Wahhabism in some ways is a reformation in the sense that it's going back to more of the violent political Islamic roots of the religion? Do you see that distinguishing, or do you disagree with that?
Well, reform ultimately, as a term, means a deep-seated change in the way it's practiced. So the Wahhabis in the mid-19th century felt that they were going to change some of the fundamental practices that were happening, and that was a reactionary medieval form of change that became much more autocratic, theocratic, and extreme. I do, my family, and especially feel that and others that are more modern and are trying to learn from the West. And, I have to tell you, one of the books that had a big impact on me was de Tocqueville's Democracy in America. And one of the things that is one of the core teachings in his book is that America was a successful democracy because it was such a faithful, God-fearing, practicing Christian society. So then people that are God-fearing do not need military dictatorship to make sure that they're not killing one another and that they care about their brothers and sisters as much as they care about their own families and others. So this type of theological modernization, if you will, is what prevents the need of dictatorships, etc. So when you get to Islamic doctrine, yes, we want to get back to the fundamentals, the Ten Commandments, the belief in God, the humility and honesty that should guide how we treat one another. And that's why, as a physician primary care doc, I focus on bioethics. I'm a bioethicist, and I believe that we are judged by God on how we treat every human being, every living creature, and nature, etc. So those are, in essence, are returning to the fundamentals. Glenn Beck has frequently referred to me as sort of the radical among Muslims, because I'm the one that's actually getting back to the core fundamental tenets and trying to step away from individuals saying that they can interpret our scripture. And actually, we are very much anti-clerical. Clerics can teach, imam simply means teacher.
Right. Yes, like rabbi.
So we're very much that there should be no intermediaries. One of the things I tell Muslims in our reform project, our Muslim reform movement, is, okay, if you believe that you can't force prayers 5 times a day, and we fast in Ramadan from sunrise to sunset, and that should be by choice, then how could you enforce coercively all the other things that you do, such as dress and head cover and the extreme treatment and marginalization of women in society and the homophobia and other things that are part of what they do? If you truly believe in individual choice for prayers and other practices, and if you believe in a judgment day, therefore you must be libertarian, in which God needs to know we live in a laboratory of freedom, so that he knows that I choose not to drink because that's my choice as a practice. You need to have legal alcohol. You need to have other things so that God knows we're making choices.
That's fascinating. I'm curious, speaking as an outsider, when you discuss this with other conservative Muslims, do they see you as a secular liberal? Like, in other words, speaking as a Christian here, if I hear liberal Christianity, it doesn't sound like Christianity to me, because the fundamentals have been changed. Are you engaged in that argument? What's the counter to that argument when you are engaged in it?
This is such an important question. I'm so glad you asked this. Please, folks need to separate where Islam is in its trajectory of history from where Christianity is in its trajectory. I have done multiple projects on faith and democracy in Europe. I was in the Netherlands a couple of years when I was on the U.S. Commission on International Religious Freedom. And the battle that our founding fathers had about religious freedom, and Jefferson's papers on religious freedom, and discussions about the role of government not establishing religion, is a very pro-religious debate about the role of government, pro-Christian, pro-practicing pietistic Christianity, if you will. Today's secular discussion, as we see in Europe, where it's becoming godless, the church-going rate is minimal. It's much less than it even used to be, and much less than America. And their hyper-secularism, the laïcité policies in France, etc., are anti-religious and thus hyper-secular, to where it becomes a atheistic cult in many ways and not about Judeo-Christian tradition. So the secular debate, groups like for Americans for the Separation of Church and State, are hyper-secular and actually anti-religious. And that's not what I'm emulating in our reform. So when you say conservative Muslims, the other arc you need to pay attention to, separate from the secular discussion in the 21st century versus that in the 18th century, within Islam, conservative Muslims, if you apply Western ideas of conservatism and liberalism, you're exactly right. My mosque says I'm some type of heretic that's an apostate and far extreme liberal, when in fact, when it comes to family values, I often describe myself as orthodox, because I say orthodox based on the rules that I believe in. Rejecting drinking alcohol and eating pork and praying 5 times a day and fasting in 30 days in Ramadan and the way we raise our kids, etc. I see myself as orthodox, but that orthodoxy is sort of in my head because it's the rules that my wife and I practice, but it really doesn't apply to any normative. There used to be 4,000 schools of Sharia thought and Sharia law around the world in the 8th, 9th, and 10th century. Now there's 4, and they're all basically the same. So there's no diversity. It's all black and white, considered conservative, but it's not conservative. It is draconian medieval law. And on the American scale of conservative and liberal, it's far, far to the right of anything we've seen in the West since the Dark Ages. So at the end of the day, it doesn't apply to America, left versus right. I'm to the right of center on most of these things in America, but it's a very different historical narrative, if you will.
It has, in other words, it has to be treated within its own logic. You can't apply what is really a French revolutionary logic of left and right that's already fake and arbitrary to something that doesn't even have its origins within that logic. It's doing injustice and damage to the concept itself.
Exactly, because the politics of left and right in the West have their own. Even from country to country, you go to Australia and their conservative party means something different. Liberal party means
totally
different from,
and not very conservative at that.
So this is the issue: is that we have to be careful not to sort of, and this is why I think Muslims, as you started out the program, Muslims are treated, I think, with a bigotry of low expectations. That somehow, let's just they use even the term Islamophobia. I reject that term because Islam is an idea. It doesn't have any rights. As much as I reject things like Quran burning and other things, I have defended to the death people's right to denigrate my scripture and other things because it's just a piece of paper. It's just an idea. Human beings have rights, but ideas don't have rights. So therefore, they call it Islamophobia because they want to make my free speech into blasphemy and thus create anti-blasphemy laws for the rest of the West that aren't even Muslim or Muslims that question them. So we have to be able to look at the lens through which they're criticizing us and labeling left versus right, because it's trying to insulate Muslims from real appropriate criticism and giving the rest a pass, no different than you would have given the rest of the Germans a pass during World War II, who were actually, through their silence, allowing Nazism to thrive. And the Muslim community needs tough love because they've allowed the Islamic regime in Iran and Pakistan and elsewhere to exist free of criticism while they blame the West, they blame Israel and every other conspiracy theory.
So you've, put your finger on something. The left's, I'm just going to use that term because unfortunately, there's not a better one, but the radical left's project to pull Muslims as a community, as an identity into their grievance list. Minorities that we can cynically exploit for votes and power. This is especially true in the last 25 years since 9/11, put a lot of scrutiny on Muslims in particular. That was juice for the left to take advantage of. Now, talk to us about this. You see guys like Zoran Mamdani in New York, soon to be the Muslim mayor of New York 25 years after 9/11. But really, his religion isn't Islam. It's obviously communism. It really is. I don't think it's an exaggeration to say he bleeds red in the communist sense. He's not a true Muslim the way you would describe yourself. What is this political alliance between America's radical left and Muslims like that, or like Ilhan Omar, who see power to be gained by aligning themselves with the Democratic Party?
This is so important. And, I testified to Congress multiple times in the past about the threat of the Muslim Brotherhood global movement, the threat of political Islamist movement. I testified in 2011 for Peter King at the Homeland Security Committee at one of the most controversial hearings since the McCarthy hearings, in which I talked about, and flanked with a couple other Muslims, we were saying, listen, the radicalization process is very easy for those of us heaped in the tradition and culture and other things to understand. And I said, you don't have to become an expert in this. And I talk about it in my book, A Battle for the Soul of Islam. A congresswoman from California, Jackie, I can't remember her last name, but she...
Rosen, I believe.
Jackie Spire. She said,
Spire, thank you.
Who are you to talk about Islam? Because you're not a cleric. I'm Catholic. I wouldn't foresee myself doing. I said, listen, you don't understand the foundations of American democracy. It was about pushing back against theocracy. And I said, this process, you don't have to be Muslim to care about this simply because of terrorism, but it's coming after this country too by radicalizing the left. And we were saying that in 2011. So the process by which Muslims are radicalized to create ideas in which the ends justify the means, in which the enemy is that we Muslims have an identity group by identity being Muslim, not by ideology that has diversity. And the left then also feeds into that, which is what you see at the UN with China working with Iran, the communists working with the Islamists against their common enemy being free-thinking, liberal country, liberal small L, libertarian type countries in the West. And similarly, we see this with Ilhan Omar working closely with AOC, where Omar is a comes from the Islamist farm team, and she's working with the socialists on the left. And I will tell you, if you look at European history, the story usually ends where, at the end of the day, the far left finally figures out that the Islamists, if they get into power, will destroy them. They are homophobic and anti-feminist and all the things that the left thinks they care about. They realize that the socialism of the Islamists is all about empowering the clerical institutions through that confiscation of funds and taxation, versus the socialists being more about a anti religious and cultish nullification of the individual through communism and Marxism. So that Marxist jihadist axis has united globally from the UN across the world, and 70% of the planet is either Muslim majority or Russia and China. They have a common enemy, and we need to understand that the infusions, whether it's coming from billions of Qatar or billions from China or billions from Soros and the far left, they have a common means in which the Black Lives Matter movements and others went across the cities in our country, legitimizing destruction of federal property, burning down businesses, etc., while we see on the right that doesn't happen because it's a value-based movement. So we have to understand that radicalization is one and the same. The radical that assassinated my friend Charlie Kirk and so many others,
yes,
he was radicalized through an identity movement. Obviously, we're learning more about it, whether it was online with transgenderism and other DEI type issues. The bottom line is, it's right out of the book of the jihadist radicalization and anti-Western and conspiracy theories, etc. So they want to stop free speech. They want to destroy American ideals. They want to spread socialism and confiscate the ideas of entrepreneurship in the West. That's why I'm actually, one of the reasons I'm running for Congress is they can tell you, it's when you say the same things I do, they can tell you you're anti-Muslim and you're a bigot, etc. But they can't say that to me. They try to, but it's much less effective. And I feel like I can provide
yes,
and become the head of the spear to protect the West, to protect America, especially from this red-green axis.
And you see, I mean, it's bad. That axis is bad enough in New York, Michigan, and Minnesota. But we just look over to what's going on in London, where you have this fusion. It's like 25 years down the road between open borders activists, unfortunately, in the Conservative and Labour parties in Britain, with very, very ultra-violent Wahhabists, Islamists, and you see how the secular government or even nominally Anglican government of Britain is even arresting people who defend themselves from Muslim rape gangs. And these are people who are coming from very, very dark countries and very, very dark places and squeezed into cities where they're having no contact with regular everyday Britons where they might assimilate into British culture. No, they're basically transplants from the Middle East. That's a terrifying reality.
And this is why one of the projects of the many ones I've been working on is, it's one thing to seal our borders, which we should have done, and thank God for President Trump's administration that's doing this now. But we also have to work on sealing the borders in a consciousness. Is that what does it mean when people immigrate here? What are they immigrating to? Do they believe in the social contract of Americanism? And I believe we should have a commission on Americanism that looks at when people come to the West, Are they coming just for economic reasons, or are they coming for ideological reasons to embrace the identity of being American? And this is why I formed a coalition that, in the 20th century, there used to be a coalition called the Committee on the Present Danger that was looking at the threat of the Soviets, et cetera, and ultimately led to the Reagan Revolution. And Senator Kyle and Senator Lieberman were co-chairing that. We formed for the 21st century a Clarity Coalition. Clarity stands for Champions for Liberty Against the Reality of Islamist Tyranny. And it's really looking to educate the West about this red-green axis and the threat. And we lead that coalition through saying what we're for. We are champions of liberty against Islamist tyranny. So if all you are is against whatever that is, the Marxism, jihadism, it's like when you're trying to stop drug flow into America. Yes, you can seal the borders, but ultimately you have to have a youth and a population that feels internally that they're not going to take or need those drugs. So what are they for? What are the principles that they believe in that'll shield them from that intoxicant? And our identity to defeat DEI identity politics, Black Lives Matter movement, by no coincidence, was led by some staunch anti-Semites of the Nation of Islam and others.
Certainly.
So ideologically, they're very anti-Western, anti-Israel, all of the ideas that we believe in. But at the end of the day, we can only defeat that by reinvigorating entrepreneurship and the family, nuclear family, and the values of things that my friends like Charlie Kirk and others were trying to go across this country talking to universities about. And that's really what we have to do, is have two prongs. One is expose the reality of the threat. And second, rebuild, renew America's promise of personal freedoms, of sovereignty, national sovereignty, and also of personal, economic
responsibility. Freedom. Yes, right. Well, Dr. Jasser, you've been a physician. You're a patriotic man. You've served in the United States Navy. You've been a champion of the Constitution and religious freedom. Now you're running for Congress. Tell us about your opponent. Give us the skinny on that race, please.
Yeah, so I'm running in CD4. The 4th District currently is misrepresented, poorly represented by Greg Stanton, the former Phoenix mayor, who's really never been deconstructed in a campaign. He's really filling that seat in fumes. And the district was redistricted in 2020. And we see in the first election that was under the new district in 2022 that it's barely a Democrat plus 2% district. So it's clearly a swing district, should be a swing district with the right candidate. And he has been missing in action. He hasn't said anything publicly when he needs to be present and lead. He has voted against the big, beautiful bill that ultimately has been to reduce taxes, to strengthen the Border Patrol and police forces and others to protect our families within the neighborhoods that are in our district and across the state. So many things he's done to misrepresent us. And the reason I'm running is, listen, Arizona is an independent state. It is a conservative state. And yet we see from our governor to our 2 senators and to people like Congressman Stanton, a misrepresentation. And people can go to my website at Z4AZ, Z4AZ.com, and see an American who loves this country, who has stepped towards the fire, both against the medical establishment during COVID and against radical Islam domestically and globally. And I'm ready to do that now for our district and our state, as not only can we do better, but by renewing America's promise and getting back to our core values as Americans, we can show that Arizona should be a red state, and we can show America that districts that are supposedly swing districts with the right candidate can become conservative and Republican.
Well, even so, I'm sure they'll find a way to paint you as a white supremacist all the same. Well, Dr. Zuhdi Jasser, we wish you well on the campaign trail, and thank you for your time and your insights today.
Thank you. I appreciate it. Thank you.
I'm Hayden Ludwig, and this is Restoration Spotlight, a project of Restoration News, your source of headline-smashing investigative journalism for the America First movement. Check us out at restoration-news.com. Until next time, stay vigilant and trust in Jesus Christ.